Thanks everybody for coming. And I want to say this photo of Calvin Coolidge was donated to this library, well, when it was Swan. And it shows Calvin Coolidge's signature on here, which you can come up and see later. And it says, photograph and signature given by Henry J. Goodman, Washington, D.C. And I'm thinking, okay, why did Henry Goodman give it to Swan Library from Washington, D.C.? So, of course, I had to do the research and find out who was who and why they were there. Come to find out, Henry Goodman was from Albion. His family was here in Albion. He moved to Washington, D.C. when he was in his early 20s. He started a clothing shop, a haberdashery for men's clothing in Washington, D.C. It just happened to be across the street from the White House. So he got a lot of business from the presidents at the White House. And in that process, he got portraits. This is 1924 of Calvin Coolidge. So it's got to be one of the first photographs of him in office. And I think that's kind of a special thing for the library to have. Calvin Coolidge was the 30th president of the United States. He was sworn into office by his father, John Calvin Coolidge. Because the previous president had passed away, Calvin was with his father. His father was a national judge, and so his father swore him into office. Bing, bang, boom, my son is president. Calvin Coolidge was nicknamed Silent Cal because he didn't talk too much. His wife was a teacher. He was famous for not reinstating officers who'd been fired during a strike by Boston police by saying, there is no right to strike against public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime. So he stood for things, whether people liked it or not. For exercise, he rode a mechanical horse in the White House. I don't know, I think these little facts are kind of cute. He was the only president born on the 4th of July. He was given a raccoon to eat for Thanksgiving dinner in 1926. Being an animal lover, he decided to pardon the raccoon, and it became a family pet called Rebecca. In 1928, it was given to a zoo. Coolidge was the only president to have his portrait on a coin during his lifetime. So there was a penny with Lincoln's picture and Coolidge behind Lincoln. And it was only produced for a short period of time, but that would be a collector's item today if anybody found one. Coolidge believed Americans of color have the same rights as all other Americans. When in 1924 a white man wrote to complain about an African-American man running for Congress, Coolidge replied, I was amazed to receive such a letter. A colored man is precisely as much entitled to submit his candidacy in a party primary as any other citizen. So there. Coolidge said Americans, whatever their background, were equal. Whether one traces his Americanisms back 3 centuries to the Mayflower or 3 years to the steerage is not half so important as whether his Americanism of today is real and genuine. No matter by what various crafts we came here, we are now all in the same boat. I think he had very cool ideas and very definitely pronounced what he was thinking. He didn't beat around the bush. He was, I guess in thinking this over, I thought, I don't want to go, he was born on such and such date. I think we can look that up in Britannica anytime we want. But I think the idea of him and what he said in speeches and just his everyday kind of countenance is what I'm interested in. What kind of person was he? In 1924, he wrote this, and this will remind you of a different talk that I gave on the Norwegian settlement in Orleans County. Honorable Gilbert N. Hagen has been good enough to hand me your letter regarding the centennial observation, which is to be held in 1925 by the American community of Norwegian descendants in celebration of a century of Norwegian immigration to this country. And that was written by Calvin Coolidge. So he acknowledged our settlement here in Orleans County. Another interesting bit about Calvin Coolidge, it was the first time in history the whole nation attended the presidential inauguration because they ran it on the radio. So any American who wanted to could turn on the radio and listen to the inauguration of a president. So it wasn't just the people that could get to Washington. It was anybody in the nation that could turn in their radio, which I thought was kind of cool. Over an area extending from Massachusetts to California and from Minnesota to Georgia, through the 21 radio broadcasting station, listeners heard Calvin Coolidge take the oath of office as the 30th President of the United States. In hotel lobbies and dining rooms, assembly halls, public parks, clubs, offices, stores, and other gathering places, crowds listened to and equipped with loudspeakers. In some cases, these were installed and operated by associated companies of bell systems. So they installed these speakers so that everyone could hear for the first time the inauguration of a president, which I think is kind of cool. He had his ideas on the black population, as you heard previously, but the KKK wanted to address a rally in Washington, and Calvin Coolidge sent them a notice. He replied to an angry protest from a Klansman over a black congressional candidate with a letter that included, among other things, this passage. During the war, 500,000 colored men and boys were called up under the draft. Not one of them sought to evade it. They took their places wherever assigned in defense of the nation, of which they are just as truly citizens as any of us are. The suggestion of denying any measure of their full political rights to such a great group of our population as the colored people is one which, however it might be received in some quarters, could not possibly be permitted by one who feels a responsibility for living up to the traditions and maintaining the principles of the Republican Party. So there. There's no doubt on what he thinks. And I found that there was a poster. It says, Norway pilgrims to this country praised by Cal. President makes principal speech at centennial celebration at Minneapolis of Norwegian settlers. So he gave an address before the Norwegian centennial celebration in Minnesota at the State Fair in 1925. He has, in his speech, almost without money or supplies, the little company of immigrants were taken in charge by the New York Quakers, who raised funds to send them to Kendall, Orleans County, New York. There they secured lands and established the first Norwegian settlement in this country. It is a curious circumstance that although the Norwegians are among the greatest seafaring peoples, this party was composed almost entirely of farmers, so that their first interest was to get land. This was from a presidential speech in 1925. He mentions Orleans County. I think that's pretty cool. It's not possible, as it is certainly not needful on this occasion, even to summarize the story of Norwegian immigration, but should be explained that while the settlement of 1825 in Orleans County, New York, was the first Norwegian settlement and represented the first organized immigration, these pioneers of the Restoration were not the first Norwegians to come here. And then he goes on to say there were a few here and there over the years. But this was the major Norwegian settlement in Orleans County. The great movement which established Norwegian communities all over the Northwest and contributed so greatly to the building of that part of the country began with the voyage of the Restoration. So the first Norwegian settlement in Orleans County was even mentioned by Calvin Coolidge in his presidential message at the Minnesota State Fairgrounds in 1925. I think that's pretty impressive that we were even mentioned. But now on to this photo. It was given by Henry Goodman. Henry Goodman was raised here in Orleans County. He left the county when he was about 19, 20, moved to Washington, D.C. He was there for several years, and then finally opened up his own clothing store. By the way, his father had a clothing store in Albion, so he followed the family tradition and opened one in Washington, D.C. In one of the books it says, in 1928, Albion citizens donated a portrait of Lily and Achilles to the library. 18 boys and 14 girls from the weekly story hour formed the Worthwhile Workers Club, helping in the library and raising money through entertainments. They bought a bookcase and a dictionary stand. Henry Goodman, Washington, D.C. haberdasher, who'd left Albion in 1886, gave his first gift of many to the library, 6 framed portraits of American generals and admirals. So now I have a clue as to why we have military men in framed pictures in the archives. Because this man gave not only this, but portraits of admirals and generals. And if you're interested, I have his advertisement that was in the Foreign Relations publications, Foreign Service Journal, for many years, like all through the 1940s and 50s. And it says, serving the menswear needs of the Department of State and the Foreign Service for over 50 years. In stock the year round, Haspel new wash and wear miracle fabrics, Dacron and cotton, Orlin and nylon, also cotton cords, Palm Beach, Arrow, Manhattan, and McGregor. Special attention to mail orders from any country. Henry J. Goodman and Company, 1707 Pennsylvania Avenue, Northwest, Washington, D.C. So there's the Albion man and his business in Washington. The Masons here in Albion received some gifts, and a couple of them came from Washington and Henry Goodman. There was a gavel. Let me see if I can see where it was. An arrangement was made with Swan Library by the Masonic Temple to have a display of memorabilia that they got, some of which from Henry Goodman in Washington, D.C. The gavel was a gift of Henry J. Goodman, a native of Albion, who later settled in Washington, D.C. and ran a haberdashery there, which supplied neckties to Presidents Coolidge, Hoover, and Roosevelt. So he was connected with 3 national presidents just by supplying them clothing. Yeah, if anybody wants to see these, I've got a couple copies of them, the advertisement that he ran in that journal for years. In the Orleans Republican in 1889 is an announcement. Cards announcing the betrothal of Henry J. Goodman and Jenny B. Nordlinger, both of Washington, D.C., have been received by Albion friends of the groom. So they got announcements here in Albion of him being married, intends to be married. Henry J. Goodman, this is in August of 1899. An old Albion boy who's been in Washington some years has opened a new clothing store on Pennsylvania Avenue opposite the White House. So, local update of what Henry's doing. And then the idea that he supplied neckties to Coolidge, Hoover, and Roosevelt. That was in the paper also. In the Forest Service Journal of December 1961, it says, still without having a chance to tell Secretary Stimson about the virtues of seersucker suits as official regalia, that was a pity, for Stimson patronized Henry J. Goodman's haberdashery on Pennsylvania Avenue, the only store in the District of Columbia where you could buy a Mackinac in August. Stimson, I felt as I sailed away to Monrovia with the sun behind my helmet in one hand and my high hat in the other, would have endorsed my project for a rational cabinet for diplomats. In other words, Henry Goodman, supplied clothing for a lot of our national diplomats and ambassadors. This is an article that was June 4th, 1945 in Time magazine. For the first time since March 4th, 1933, ex-President Herbert Hoover this week entered the White House. And it goes on to say why he was there. And at the end of the article it says, it was by no means his first return to Washington. However, he has frequently testified before congressional committees, still buys tall starched collars from Henry J. Goodman and Company, Pennsylvania Avenue haberdasher. So even the update on President Hoover includes a mention of our man, Mr. Goodman. That was about him going into them again. Henry Goodman passed away in Washington, D.C. And when I understood where he was buried, I understood he was Jewish. He was buried in the Jewish Hebrew Congregation Cemetery in Washington, D.C. And I think that's interesting to know also. He was a Jewish man from Albion who became well known to at least 3 presidents and supplied them with clothing. I think that's awesome. Anybody have any questions?